Let's say God puts two people on Earth and they are lucky enough to find one another.
Wise men say
Is everything just chance, or is some things meant to be?
only fools rush in.
You ever feel like that?
Like what?
But I can't
Like you were
help
just destined for someone?
falling in love
Yes.
with you.
It's life's greatest treasure, to love.
Wise men say
You showed me that a heart full of love was the most precious treasure of all.
fools rush in, but I can't help falling in love with you.
I'd fallen in love with you. And nothing that happened or didn't happen or might happen was ever going to change it.
But
I would never be happy with anyone else as long as you walk the earth.
The one thing I've known, without a doubt, the whole time, is you belong together.
The two of you have always been connected. Everything that you've gone through keeps leading you back to each other.
You brought me home. You brought light into my life and chased away all the darkness.
I didn't think it was possible to love as much as I love you.
I love you more and more every day, if it's even possible to love someone that much. I knew from the moment I saw you that you'd be in my life for a long time. But I didn't know you would be my life, my heart, my home.
You're my best friend. You're my home. And you're my true love. And I am yours and will be forever.
You two are now one, and you live happily ever after.